What if I told you that the most terrifying moments in our lives aren't found in horror movies or haunted houses, but in the split second when your brain realizes that something fundamentally wrong is happening right in front of you? That moment when every instinct in your body screams danger, but your rational mind hasn't quite caught up yet. Today, we're going to explore something far more unsettling than any fictional ghost story. We're diving deep into real encounters that happened during what should have been innocent Halloween celebrations. And more importantly, we're going to understand why these experiences leave psychological scars that last for decades. Over the next half hour, I'm going to take you through a comprehensive analysis of genuine horror encounters, examining not just what happened, but why our brains respond the way they do to these situations. We'll explore the psychology of fear, the neuroscience behind traumatic memories, and the darker reality of how predators use our cultural celebrations as cover for disturbing behavior. By the end of this deep dive, you'll understand why certain experiences during childhood can fundamentally reshape how we perceive safety and danger for the rest of our lives. But before we begin, I need to warn you that some of these accounts are genuinely disturbing. They involve children being stalked, people in masks engaging in predatory behavior, and the kind of real-world horror that makes fictional scary stories seem tame by comparison. These aren't creepypastas or urban legends. These are documented experiences that reveal something deeply troubling about human behavior during October, when the boundary between acceptable fear and genuine threat becomes dangerously blurred. The psychology of childhood fear and memory. Let's start by understanding something crucial about how our brains work, particularly during childhood. When you're young, your brain is essentially a sponge, not just for learning language or math, but for learning what's dangerous and what's safe. Every experience during childhood contributes to building what psychologists call your threat detection system. This is the part of your brain that determines, often in milliseconds, whether you should fight, flee, or freeze in a given situation. The fascinating and terrifying thing about childhood memories of fear is that they're encoded differently than normal memories. When something genuinely frightening happens to a child, the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, floods the system with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These hormones actually cause the memory to be encoded more deeply and more permanently than everyday memories. This is why you might not remember what you had for breakfast last Tuesday, but you can recall with crystal clarity that moment when you were 7 years old and something scared you half to death. This biological mechanism exists for good reason. Throughout human evolution, remembering dangerous situations kept us alive. If you encountered a predator once and survived, your brain wanted to make absolutely certain you never forgot that experience, so you could avoid it in the future. But here's where it gets complicated in modern society. This same mechanism that evolved to help us remember dangerous animals now activates when we encounter dangerous humans. And the memories are just as vivid, just as permanent, and just as capable of influencing our behavior decades later. Consider what happens when a child encounters someone in a costume during Halloween. Under normal circumstances, the child's brain understands this is play. The context clues are all there. Parents are nearby. Other children are laughing. The environment is controlled and safe. But what happens when those context clues disappear? What happens when a child encounters someone in a costume in the wrong place at the wrong time, behaving in ways that trigger every evolutionary alarm bell we have? The brain doesn't care that it's October and costumes are normal. The brain only cares about survival. When we talk about encounters with people in clown costumes lurking in alleyways, or figures in white robes kneeling motionless in the darkness, we're not just talking about momentary scares. We're talking about experiences that can fundamentally alter a person's threat detection system. The child who encounters something like this isn't just scared in the moment. Their brain is literally rewiring itself to be hyper-vigilant about similar situations for the rest of their life. This is why someone can be 22 years old and still feel their heart race when they see an abandoned house, or why a 30-year-old adult might feel inexplicable anxiety about alleyways even though they consciously know they're probably safe. The Predator's Advantage: How Halloween Creates Opportunities. Now we need to discuss something deeply uncomfortable but absolutely essential to understand. Halloween creates a unique set of circumstances that certain individuals exploit for disturbing purposes. This isn't about demonizing a holiday or creating paranoia. This is about understanding how predatory behavior works and why October presents specific challenges for child safety that don't exist during other times of the year. Think about what Halloween normalizes in our society. For 1 month out of the year, it becomes completely acceptable for adults to wear masks and costumes that obscure their identity. It becomes normal for strangers to approach children. It becomes expected that people will be out after dark in greater numbers than usual. Abandoned buildings get decorated as haunted attractions. Empty lots become temporary venues. And perhaps most significantly, the boundary between what's considered a scary prank and what's actually threatening behavior becomes incredibly blurred. A person wearing a clown costume and standing motionless in an alleyway during July would immediately be reported to police and likely evaluated for mental health concerns. That same person in that same location in October might be dismissed as someone trying to create atmosphere for Halloween, or playing a prank, or perhaps working for some haunted attraction nearby. This plausible deniability is precisely what makes October so attractive to individuals with malicious intent. Let's examine the behavioral patterns we see in these documented encounters. In multiple cases, we see individuals wearing costumes who engage in behavior that has absolutely no innocent explanation. They're not interacting with groups of trick-or-treaters. They're not near any organized Halloween events. Instead, they're positioned in isolated locations where children might be alone or in small groups. They're watching, waiting, and in some cases, actively pursuing children who notice them. This is textbook predatory behavior with a seasonal disguise. The costume serves multiple purposes for someone with bad intentions. First, it obscures identity, making it nearly impossible for victims to provide useful descriptions to police. Second, it provides psychological intimidation. A clown mask or an unusual costume triggers instinctive fear responses, especially in children, which can freeze them or cause panic that makes them easier to control. Third, and perhaps most insidiously, it provides plausible deniability if the predator is spotted by adults before they can act on their intentions. Consider the account of the child who saw someone in a clown costume at their mother's apartment complex. This wasn't someone walking down the street in costume on Halloween night. This was someone positioned at the end of an alleyway, motionless, watching children play. When noticed, they began moving closer, and it became clear there were multiple individuals involved, coordinating their positions. This isn't pranking behavior. This isn't someone trying to create Halloween atmosphere. This is surveillance and stalking behavior, pure and simple, with costumes being used as camouflage. The most chilling aspect is what happened later that same night. One of these individuals climbed to a second-story window. Think about the level of premeditation and effort that requires. Think about what it means that someone was willing to scale a building to reach a child's window. The only thing that prevented a potentially catastrophic outcome was that the child screamed and alerted adults. But how many children in similar situations don't scream? How many freeze instead? How many assume it must be a prank because it's October and scary things are supposed to happen? The phenomenon of abandoned spaces and psychological vulnerability. There's another dimension to these Halloween encounters that we need to explore, and it relates to how abandoned or decrepit spaces interact with our psychology. Human beings have an instinctive response to places that appear neglected or abandoned. These spaces trigger what researchers call prospect refuge theory, which suggests that humans instinctively prefer environments where we can see without being seen, where we can survey our surroundings while remaining protected. Abandoned houses, vacant buildings, and deteriorating structures violate this sense of safety in a fundamental way. These are spaces where visibility is poor, where unknown people could be hiding, where normal social rules don't seem to apply. During most of the year, we simply avoid these places. Children are taught to stay away from abandoned buildings. Adults feel uncomfortable near them. But October changes this calculus in dangerous ways. Suddenly, that creepy abandoned house isn't just something to avoid. It becomes a curiosity, a dare, a potential source of thrills. Children dare each other to approach these places. Teenagers might explore them, looking for places to hang out or party. And critically, the people who actually occupy these spaces, whether they're squatters, homeless individuals dealing with mental health crises, or people with actively malicious intent, suddenly have a stream of potential victims coming to them instead of avoiding them. The account of the 11-year-old who was chased by someone living in a vacant house illustrates this perfectly. For weeks, someone was using that abandoned building as a base of operations for watching children walk home from school. The decrepit state of the building provided perfect cover. No one expected anyone to be living there, so no one was monitoring it. The person inside could watch through windows without fear of being noticed because everyone assumed the building was empty. When this individual finally acted on their intentions and chased the child, think about what was going through that kid's mind. Every horror story they'd ever heard, every scary movie they'd watched, every warning about abandoned places suddenly became real. The psychological impact of being proven right about your fears, of having your worst imaginings validated by reality, is profound and lasting. This is why that person, now 22 years old, still feels fear when passing abandoned or creepy-looking houses. Their childhood brain learned a lesson that can never be fully unlearned. Sometimes the things we fear are actually real, and the places we instinctively avoid are dangerous for good reason. But there's an even more disturbing dimension to consider. When police investigated, they found no one living in the house officially. It had been vacant for years. This means someone was using it temporarily, moving in and out, possibly using it specifically during October, when suspicious behavior could more easily be dismissed as Halloween-related. This suggests a level of planning and awareness that should deeply concern anyone responsible for child safety. The cultural disconnect. When celebration masks danger, one of the most fascinating and troubling aspects of these Halloween encounters is how cultural context can completely override our instincts for self-preservation. We need to understand how powerful cultural expectations are in shaping our interpretation of events, and how this can put people, especially children, at serious risk. Consider the account from rural Poland, where Halloween isn't widely celebrated and is even viewed with suspicion by older generations. In this context, someone wearing a white robe and kneeling motionless near an abandoned stable in the middle of the night has no innocent explanation. There's no cultural framework that makes this behavior seem normal or acceptable. When the dog started barking frantically and the person realized they were being watched by this figure, their instinct was immediate and clear: this is dangerous. Get away now. Contrast this with how the same situation might be perceived in American culture during October. Someone in an unusual costume behaving strangely might be dismissed as an elaborate Halloween decoration, a prank, someone practicing for a haunted house attraction, or just an eccentric person getting really into the holiday spirit. This cultural framework that normalizes strange behavior in October can override our instincts and delay our recognition of genuine danger. This is precisely what predators and criminals count on. The person or people wearing white robes and kneeling in the darkness near that stable in Poland weren't there by accident. They were there for hours, waiting for something. And later that night, they set the building on fire. This was premeditated criminal activity, possibly with ritualistic elements. And the only reason the person walking their dog wasn't harmed or worse was because they listened to their instincts and their dog's warning, instead of trying to rationalize what they were seeing. But here's what's truly unsettling. If that same scenario had played out in the United States during October, would the person have reacted the same way? Or would they have hesitated, thinking it must be some kind of Halloween thing, buying time for those individuals to act on whatever their intentions were? This is the dangerous edge that Halloween creates. It makes us second-guess our instincts. It makes us question whether something that feels wrong is actually wrong, or if we're just being paranoid about someone's creative costume or elaborate prank. The psychological term for this is normalcy bias, which is our tendency to underestimate the possibility of disaster and assume that everything will function normally, even when we're receiving signals that something is very wrong. During Halloween, normalcy bias gets amplified because we've been culturally conditioned to expect unusual, even slightly disturbing things to be part of the celebration rather than warnings of actual danger. Think about how many horror movie plots rely on this exact dynamic. A character sees something disturbing but assumes it's part of Halloween festivities until it's too late. This isn't just fiction mirroring reality. This is fiction showing us a vulnerability in how we process threat during October. And unfortunately, some people in the real world understand and exploit this vulnerability. The neuroscience of uncanny encounters. Now let's dive into what's actually happening in your brain during these encounters, because understanding the neuroscience helps explain why these experiences are so traumatic and why they create such lasting memories. When you see something that your brain registers as fundamentally wrong, as violating natural patterns of human movement or behavior, you're experiencing what's called the uncanny valley effect. But in a real-world, high-stakes situation, the uncanny valley is usually discussed in relation to robots or computer-generated characters that look almost but not quite human, creating a sense of unease. But this same neural response occurs when we see actual humans behaving in ways that seem off or wrong. When someone moves without appearing to walk normally, when they stand perfectly still for extended periods, when they tilt their head at unnatural angles, your brain receives conflicting signals. Part of your brain, specifically the visual cortex and the areas responsible for recognizing human movement, is saying this is a person. But another part of your brain, the part that has spent your entire life learning the patterns of normal human behavior, is screaming that something is wrong with this person. This conflict between recognition and wrongness creates intense psychological distress because your threat detection system doesn't know how to categorize what it's seeing. The account of the figure at the pumpkin patch that appeared to glide rather than walk perfectly illustrates this phenomenon. When something moves in a way that violates our expectations of how humans move, it triggers deep instinctive fear. This isn't learned fear. This is hardwired into our brains because throughout human evolution, individuals who moved strangely or behaved abnormally were often diseased, injured, or mentally unstable, all of which represented potential threats to the group. But here's where it gets even more interesting from a neuroscience perspective. When you experience this kind of uncanny encounter, your brain is simultaneously trying to do two things. First, it's trying to identify the threat and determine the appropriate response. Second, it's trying to find an explanation that makes sense, that fits the encounter into a framework you can understand. This is why people who experience these encounters often describe a moment of confusion or disbelief before the fear fully sets in. Your rational brain is saying this must be a decoration, or a prank, or someone in a costume for Halloween. But your emotional brain, specifically the amygdala, is already flooding your system with adrenaline and preparing your body to fight or flee. This disconnect between rational interpretation and emotional response creates a kind of psychological paralysis that can be dangerous. You might stand there trying to figure out what you're seeing instead of immediately running away, which is exactly what someone with malicious intent might be counting on. The gliding movement described in the pumpkin patch encounter is particularly significant because it's a behavior that some predators use deliberately. By moving in ways that seem unnatural or supernatural, they're exploiting this neural confusion to delay their victim's flight response. If you see someone running toward you normally, your brain immediately processes that as a threat and triggers your own flight response. But if you see something moving toward you in a way that your brain can't immediately classify as normal human movement, you might freeze instead of running because your brain is stuck trying to process what it's seeing. The long-term psychological impact and coping mechanisms. As we come to the end of this deep analysis, we need to discuss the long-term psychological consequences of these encounters and what they teach us about trauma, memory, and how we develop coping mechanisms for dealing with fear. Every single person whose account we've discussed mentioned that their encounter continues to affect them years or even decades later. This isn't weakness or being overly sensitive. This is normal human psychology, responding to experiences that fundamentally challenge their sense of safety. When a child's understanding of the world is violated by an encounter with genuine danger, especially danger that came disguised as something that should have been fun or normal, it creates what psychologists call a schema disruption. A schema is essentially a mental framework for understanding how the world works. Children have schemas about safety, about adults, about appropriate behavior, about holidays and celebrations. When something happens that violates these schemas, the child's brain has to rebuild its understanding of reality to incorporate this new information. For the child who was chased from an abandoned house, their schema about adult behavior was permanently altered. They learned that adults don't always follow the rules, that danger can lurk in places everyone else ignores, and that their fear of creepy houses wasn't irrational, but actually protective. For the person who encountered figures in clown costumes at their mother's apartment, they learned that Halloween can provide cover for predatory behavior, and that alleyways are genuinely dangerous spaces. For the individual at the pumpkin patch, they learned that even seemingly safe, family-friendly environments can harbor threats that others don't see or acknowledge. These aren't irrational fears or phobias. These are adaptive responses based on real experiences. The problem is that these adaptive responses can become overgeneralized, creating anxiety in situations that are actually safe, but share surface similarities with the dangerous encounter. This is why someone might feel uncomfortable around all abandoned houses, even though most pose no actual threat, or why someone might avoid alleyways, even in broad daylight, in safe neighborhoods. Understanding this helps us appreciate why dismissing these fears or telling people to just get over them is both unhelpful and potentially harmful. These fears exist because something real happened that proved the world is less safe than the person thought it was. The fear is functioning exactly as it's supposed to, trying to protect them from similar situations in the future. The challenge is learning to recalibrate that fear response so it doesn't interfere with daily life while still maintaining appropriate caution. What these accounts ultimately reveal is something crucial about Halloween and child safety that often goes undiscussed. We focus so much on traffic safety, checking candy, and ensuring kids don't eat too much sugar that we miss the more fundamental risk. October creates conditions where predatory behavior can be camouflaged as holiday celebration. The person in the clown costume isn't necessarily going to offer poisoned candy. They're going to use the costume to get close to children in situations where the children's normal stranger danger instincts are suppressed by the context of Halloween. As we wrap up this analysis, the key takeaway isn't that Halloween is too dangerous or that we should cancel October celebrations. The takeaway is that we need to maintain awareness that cultural contexts can override our natural threat detection systems, and that children especially need to be taught that not everything strange or scary during October is part of the fun. Sometimes a person in a costume standing in the wrong place at the wrong time isn't trying to create Halloween atmosphere. Sometimes they're a genuine threat, and recognizing that difference could be life-saving. The people who shared these experiences did so because they want others to understand that real horror doesn't look like the movies. It looks like a figure standing motionless in an alleyway. It looks like someone watching from a window of a house that's supposed to be empty. It looks like something moving toward you in a way that your brain knows isn't quite right. Trust those instincts. Trust that feeling when something seems off. Because sometimes the scariest thing about Halloween is that it makes us doubt whether we should be scared at all.